The auction hall smelled like rust, engine grease, and broken dreams, and Cale Morrow sat in the very last row like a man who had already given up on everything. He was 34 years old, and he had 113 credits in his account, which was not enough to buy a decent meal on this station, not enough to book passage to anywhere worth going, and certainly not enough to start over the way he kept telling himself he would. The Rustwalk Exchange was the kind of place where the galaxy sent its leftovers: broken ships, dead land, salvage rights to planets nobody remembered colonizing in the first place. And the people who came here to buy were usually just as broken as the things they bid on. Cale fit right in. He had been a freight hauler for 11 years, running cargo between colony worlds for a logistics corps that paid badly and worked him harder than any machine, and then one day a loading crane had failed and dropped 9 tons of mining equipment on his left leg. And just like that, his career was over. They gave him a medical discharge, a small payout that was already gone, and a pat on the back that felt more like a shove out the door. So here he was, watching lots go by on the auction screen, each one more depressing than the last. A salvage claim on a ship that had burned up in the atmosphere, mineral rights to a moon that turned out to be hollow, a water processor that had not worked since before Cale was born. He was not planning to buy anything, because what would be the point? But he stayed in his seat anyway, because he had nowhere else to go, and the auction hall was at least warm. The auctioneer was a thin Corvalli woman with 4 eyes and a voice that could cut through steel, and she moved through the lots with the speed of someone who wanted to go home. "Lot 7741, she called out, and the screen behind her flickered to life, showing an overhead image of a dusty desert, orange-brown landscape, dotted with small rectangular structures that looked like they had been dropped from orbit and forgotten. Settlement deed, Arion 4 surface, town designation Harrowfield, approximately 40 prefabricated structures, status abandoned, environmental hazard classification low, starting bid 100 credits. Silence filled the room, like water filling a sinking ship. Nobody moved, nobody raised a hand, and the auctioneer waited for exactly 3 seconds before she started to move on. And that was when Cale did the stupidest thing he had ever done in his entire life. He raised his hand. The auctioneer stopped and looked at him with all 4 eyes, and there was something in her expression that was halfway between pity and amusement, like she was watching a man walk into a wall on purpose. 100 credits from the gentleman in the back, she said, and she paused for a moment, as if giving the universe one last chance to stop this from happening. And when nobody else bid, she brought the hammer down. "Sold. Congratulations, sir. You are now the proud owner of a ghost town." A few people in the hall turned to look at Cale, and he could feel their stares like little needles. But he just sat there with his hands on his knees and thought about what he had just done. He had 113 credits, and now he had 13, and in exchange, he owned 40 broken buildings on a dead world that nobody in the galaxy cared about. It was, without question, the worst deal in the history of commerce. But for reasons he could not explain, not then and not later, something in his chest felt lighter than it had in months. 3 hours later, Cale was sitting in a battered shuttle that rattled like a box of screws as it dropped through the atmosphere of Arion 4. And when he looked out the window, he saw a world that was exactly as empty as he expected. The sky was a pale orange that faded to gray near the horizon, and the ground was red-brown dust and rocky canyons that stretched in every direction like cracks in old skin. And there was no green anywhere, no water that he could see, no sign that anything had ever lived here or wanted to. The shuttle set down on a cracked landing pad at the edge of Harrowfield, and when Cale stepped out, the wind hit him in the face like a slap from a disappointed parent, dry, cold, and full of dust, He stood there for a moment, looking at his town. It was not much of a town. 40 prefab buildings stood in 2 rough rows along what might have once been a street, and most of them were covered in dust so thick it looked like they were slowly being swallowed by the planet itself. And the ones that were not covered in dust had broken windows and doors that hung open like mouths frozen mid-scream. There was a water tower at one end that had collapsed sideways and was leaning against what appeared to be a storage warehouse, and at the other end there was a larger building with the words Community Hall still visible on its front wall. Though the paint was so faded, it was barely more than a ghost of letters. Cale picked up his one bag, everything he owned in the universe, and walked down the street, his boots crunching on dust and grit. And the sound was the only sound there was. No birds, no engines, no voices, nothing but the wind and his footsteps, and the creak of old metal settling under a sun that was too far away to give real warmth. He chose the 3rd building on the left, because it was the only one whose door was still attached to its frame. And when he kicked it open, the hinges screamed like they had not been touched in years. Inside was a single room, with a cot, a table, a dead power terminal, and a layer of dust that told a story of absolute abandonment. Cale dropped his bag on the cot, sat down, and looked at the ceiling. "Home," he said to no one, and his voice sounded small and strange in the silence. He spent the rest of the daylight hours doing what he could. He found the solar array behind the row of buildings and cleaned the dust off 4 of the panels, which gave him just enough power to run a light and charge his comm pad. And he checked the water reclamation unit in Building 7 and found that it was damaged, but not dead, which was better than he expected. By the time the sun went down, he had a working light, half a ration bar in his stomach, and a cot that was only slightly more comfortable than the floor. He lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the walls, and he thought about how strange it was that a man could end up owning an entire town and still have absolutely nothing. Sleep came slowly, the way it always did for him, in pieces, in fits, in the spaces between one worry and the next, and then somewhere in the deepest part of the night, he heard. It was faint at first, so faint that he thought it was the wind playing tricks through the old pipes. But then it grew just a little stronger, and he realized it was not wind at all. It was a sound, low, rhythmic, almost musical, and it was coming from somewhere beneath the ground, from the direction of the community hall across the street. Cale sat up on his cot, his heart beating faster than it should have been, and he listened. The sound rose and fell like breathing, like something alive and ancient was singing to itself in the dark beneath his feet. And it was not mechanical, and it was not wind, and it was not anything he had ever heard before in all his years of hauling freight across the galaxy. It sounded, more than anything else, like a lullaby. Cale sat in the dark, listening, and for the first time since he had arrived on this dead, empty, forgotten world, he did not feel alone, and that scared him more than the silence ever had. Cale did not sleep for the rest of that night. He lay on his cot with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, while that strange humming sound drifted in and out of hearing, like a tide made of music. And every time he thought it had stopped, it would start again, soft and low and impossible to ignore. By the time the pale orange light of dawn crept through the cracks in his walls, he had already made up his mind. He was going to find out what was making that sound. Because if he was going to live in a ghost town, he at least wanted to know what kind of ghost he was dealing with. He crossed the street to the community hall, with a flashlight in one hand and a heavy wrench in the other, because Cale Morrow was a practical man, and practical men did not walk into dark basements without something to hit things with. The front door of the community hall was stuck, swollen with years of dust and moisture that had crept in and dried 100 times over. His shoulder into it twice before it gave way with a groan that echoed through the empty building. Inside was a large open room with overturned chairs and a long table pushed against one wall, and everything was covered in that same thick dust that made the whole town look like it was slowly turning into a memory. At the back of the room, half hidden behind a fallen shelf, was a hatch in the floor. Heavy metal, the kind they used for storm shelters and root cellars on colony worlds. And when Cale knelt beside it, he could feel the faintest vibration coming through the metal, a pulse that matched the rhythm of the sound he had heard in the night. He grabbed the handle and pulled. The hatch opened with a screech of old hinges, and a wave of warm air rose out of the darkness below, carrying a smell that was unlike anything Cale had ever encountered, sweet and mineral and alive, like wet stone in a garden after rain, but with something else underneath, something that made the hairs on his arms stand straight up. He pointed his flashlight down and saw a metal ladder descending into what looked like a root cellar, but wider and deeper than any root cellar had a right to be, and the walls were not bare metal or stone, but were instead covered in a faintly glowing substance, a kind of resin that pulsed with dim light in shades of blue and violet. Cale went down. The ladder took him about 4 meters below the surface, and when his boots hit the floor, he found himself in a tunnel that stretched in both directions, connecting to what must have been an older mining sublevel from before the colony was established. The air was warm down here, much warmer than the surface, and the bioluminescent resin on the walls gave off enough light that he almost did not need his flashlight. And the humming sound was louder now, clear and unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel to his right. Opened into a wider chamber, roughly circular, and there in the center was something that made Cale stop walking and stop breathing all at once. 5 cocoons sat in a bed of dark, rich soil that had been carefully shaped into a shallow basin, and each cocoon was about the size of a melon, oblong and smooth, and they glowed, really truly glowed with soft light that shifted between green and gold and a color that was almost pink, but not quite. They pulsed together in a rhythm, and the humming came from them, from inside them, a sound that was so gentle and so full of life that it made Cale's chest hurt in a way he did not understand. He took a step closer, reaching out with one hand without thinking about it, and then something hit him from above like a falling wall. He was on the ground before he even knew what had happened, the wrench flying from his hand, his flashlight spinning across the floor and throwing wild shadows on the walls. Lifted, actually lifted off the ground, and slammed against the tunnel wall with a force that knocked the air out of his lungs. 4 arms held him pinned, 2 gripping his shoulders and 2 pressing against his chest, and he found himself looking into a face that was not human. She was tall, taller than him by a head, with pale gray skin that was smooth like stone worn by water, and large dark eyes that were shifting color rapidly, going from black to deep red to a burning amber that meant nothing good for Cale. Bioluminescent markings ran across her face and down her neck and along all 4 of her arms, and right now those markings were blazing with light in sharp, aggressive patterns, reds and oranges that pulsed like warning signals, like alarms, like the last thing a prey animal sees before the end. She was terrifying and beautiful and absolutely furious. She spoke, but not in Galactic Common. The words came out in a language that sounded like wind, chimes breaking, sharp and musical and desperate. And Cale could not understand a single word, but he understood the meaning perfectly. "Get away from my children." I am not here to hurt anyone," Cale managed to say, and his voice came out thin and breathless, because her 2 lower arms were pressing hard enough against his ribs to make breathing a luxury. "I just bought this town. I own this land. I did not know anyone was down here." She stared at him, those color-shifting eyes searching his face with an intensity that felt like she was reading every thought he had ever had. And her nostrils flared, and Cale realized she was smelling him. Not just the surface smell, but something deeper, something chemical, something that went beyond what human senses could detect. Whatever she found, it made her pause. The pressure on his chest eased by a fraction, not enough to escape but enough to breathe, and she spoke again. Galactic common that sounded like she had learned it from a damaged language file. You are not hegemony. No, Kale said quickly. No, I am not hegemony. I am not military. I am not anything. I am just a guy who spent his last 100 credits on a ghost town because he had nothing better to do. She held him there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 10 seconds, and then she released him and stepped back, placing herself between Kale and the cocoons, with all 4 arms spread wide in a posture that was unmistakably protective. Kale slid down the wall and sat on the tunnel floor, catching his breath, and he looked at her, really looked at her, and what he saw beneath the threat display and the blazing markings was something he recognized. She was exhausted. Not just tired, but deeply, fundamentally drained in the way that only comes from running for too long with too much to protect and not enough of anything else. And her arms, for all their strength, were thin, and the bioluminescent markings on her skin were dimmer than they should have been, flickering like a light that was running out of power. She was starving, he realized, and she had been starving for a while. Over the next few hours, sitting on the floor of that tunnel, with the cocoons humming softly between them, Kale learned her story in pieces. Her name was Zale Ree. Zale, she said, when his tongue could not manage the full sound. And she was Vathari, a species that the galactic hegemony had declared a Class 7 invasive species 18 months ago. Invasive, she repeated the word like it tasted like poison, her broken common getting stronger when her anger gave it fuel. Our world. They wanted our world. The minerals, the deep soil, everything. So they call us invasive on our own home, and they come with ships, and they burn, and they... She stopped, and her markings went dim, almost dark. Finish, because he could see the ending in her eyes. She had escaped with her clutch, 5 unhatched children in their cocoon stage. And she had run across half the galaxy looking for a world with the right soil composition for them to complete their metamorphosis. And Arion 4, this dead, forgotten, worthless rock that nobody wanted, had exactly what her children needed. She had been hiding beneath Harrowfield for 4 months, alone, feeding the soil with nutrients she scavenged from the surface, singing to her cocoons every night to guide their growth, and slowly starving because she gave everything she found to the earth that held her children. Kale sat there and listened to all of it, and when she was done, he looked at the 5 cocoons glowing in their bed of dark soil, and he looked at Zale with her dim markings and her thin arms and her eyes that held more grief than any one person should have to carry. He thought about leaving. It would be easy. Could go back to his building and pretend he had never come down here, and it was not his problem, and not his species, and not his fight. He thought about all of that for about 3 seconds. Then he stood up, climbed the ladder, walked to his building, grabbed every ration bar he had left, all 6 of them, his entire food supply, and brought them back down into the tunnel. He held them out to her. Jael stared at the ration bars, then at him, and her eyes shifted to a color he had not seen before, a deep, confused blue that seemed to mean something between disbelief and the beginning of hope. "Why?" she asked. Kale shrugged in the way that humans shrug when they do not have the words for something that runs deeper than language. "Looks like we are neighbors," he said, "and where I come from, you feed your neighbors." She took the ration bars with her 2 lower hands, while her upper hand stayed raised in a defensive posture. Not quite believe this was real, and Kale sat back down on the tunnel floor across from her and her clutch, and listened to the cocoons hum their strange and gentle song. He had 13 credits, no food, and a ghost town full of dust, and now, apparently, he had a family to take care of. The first week was the hardest, because Kale had given all his food to Jael, and that meant he had to figure out how to survive on a dead world with 13 credits and a talent for fixing things that were not supposed to be fixable. He started with the solar array. There were 20 panels behind the main row of buildings, and most of them were cracked or buried under years of dust. But Cale had spent 11 years hauling freight and fixing engines that broke down in the middle of nowhere. And if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was make broken things work again. He cleaned every panel by hand, crawling across the array on his stomach, with a rag that had already been a rag before he found it. And by the end of the first day, he had 12 panels producing power, which was enough to run the water reclamation unit in Building 7. The water unit took him 3 more days because the filtration membrane was shot and the pump motor had seized. But he pulled the membrane from a backup unit in Building 12 and rebuilt the motor using parts from a broken ventilation fan. And on the evening of the 4th day, clean water came sputtering out of the tap like a miracle wrapped in rust. He brought the first container of water down to Jael, and she drank it with a desperation that made him look away, because it felt too private, too raw, like watching someone pray. The food problem was harder. Cale spent hours going through every building in Harrowfield, searching cabinets and storage rooms and hidden panels, and he found things. Not a lot of things, but enough. Emergency ration packs in a locked cabinet in the old medical station, a case of nutrient paste tubes that were 5 years past their expiration date, but still sealed, and a box of protein bars in what had once been someone's personal quarters. He split everything down the middle, half for him and half for Jael. Color-shifting eyes, and said nothing, but her markings flickered in soft blues that he was beginning to understand meant something close to gratitude. He also found something that was not food, but was maybe more important, an old colony comm relay in the community hall's upper floor, still connected to the orbital satellite network, damaged but repairable. It took him 2 weeks to get it working, using wire from Building 9 and a power coupling from the shuttle's emergency kit. And when it finally hummed to life and showed him a connection signal, he felt a rush of relief so strong it made his hands shake. He used it carefully, because he was not stupid, and he knew that signals on dead worlds attracted attention the way light attracted insects. He created a fake identity, routed his connection through 3 different relay stations, and placed a single small order with an orbital supply depot for basic provisions, charged to the last of his credits. Much dried food, basic medical supplies, a water purification tablet set, but it was enough to keep them alive for another month. And during those weeks, while Cale worked himself to the bone above ground, something was changing below. Jael began to trust him. It did not happen all at once. It happened in small moments, in tiny shifts that were easy to miss if you were not paying attention. But Cale was paying attention, because he had nothing else to pay attention to. She stopped flinching when he came down the ladder. That was the first thing, and it happened around day 5, and he noticed it the way you notice when a wild animal stops running when you approach. She started meeting him at the bottom of the ladder. That was around day 8, and sometimes she would take the water container from his hands before he reached the last rung, and her upper arms would reach while her lower arms stayed close to her body, which he learned was the Vathari, equivalent of being cautious but willing. And then around day 12, she said his name for the first time. Not human or you, but Cale. And the way she said it, with a slight musical lilt that her species put on every word, made it sound like a different name entirely. A better name. A name that belonged to someone who mattered. She began to teach him things. The Vathari were not just another alien species, she explained in her slowly improving common. They were old, one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the galaxy, and they had a connection to stone and soil that went deeper than culture or tradition. We grow from the earth, she told him one evening while they sat in the tunnel, watching the cocoons pulse with light. Our children are born twice, once when the mother carries them, and once when the earth carries them. The cocoon stage is the earth birth, and the soil must be right, or they will not become who they are meant to be. Hymn about communal memory, how the Vathari passed knowledge and emotion through bioluminescent patterns, singing light to each other in complex sequences that carried more information than any spoken language. How a mother's song during the cocoon stage literally shaped who her children would become. She sang to the cocoons every night, and the songs were not sounds that human ears could fully process. They were part voice and part light, her markings cycling through patterns so complex and beautiful that Kale would sit and watch with his mouth open like a child seeing stars for the first time. He gave the cocoons names. He could not help it. It was a human thing, this need to name everything, to make it personal and close and real, and he named them by their glow color, because that was the only way he could tell them apart. The brightest one, the one that pulsed with warm gold, he called Sunny, and the one that glowed deep blue he called Navy. Smallest one that flickered between green and white he called Spark, and the two that sat close together and always pulsed in sync he called the Twins. Zale pretended to be annoyed by the names. They will have true names when they hatch, she told him, and her markings flashed in a pattern that was sharp and corrective. Names that are sung, not spoken. Your mouth names are— She searched for the word. Ridiculous, she decided. But Kale caught her markings glowing in soft, warm tones whenever he used the names. And once, late at night when she thought he was asleep on the tunnel floor, where he sometimes dozed, he heard her whisper Sunny to the golden cocoon while she sang, and her light patterns wrapped around the word like an embrace. He taught her human things in return. He taught her how to play cards with a battered deck he found in Building 4, and she was terrible at it because her face could not lie on her skin, which made bluffing impossible, and she accused him of cheating when he won, which he absolutely was but would never admit. He taught her human expressions, and she found every single one of them baffling. "It is raining cats and dogs," she repeated one evening, all four hands pausing in mid-gesture. "This is, your sky produces animals? This is a weather phenomenon." "It means it is raining very hard," Kale said. "Then why do you not say that?" "Because humans are strange," he admitted, and she made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough to count. One evening, while he was replacing a cracked seal on the waterline, and she was sitting in the doorway of the community hall, watching him work with the Vathari equivalent of fascinated confusion, she asked him the question she had been holding back since the first day. "Why do you do this, Kale?" He did not look up from the seal. "Do what?" "Everything. The water, the power, the food. You had nothing, and you gave half of your nothing to me and my children. Your species does not know my species. Your world does not owe mine anything, and you are not gaining profit or power or status from this. So why?" Kale stopped working and sat back on his heels and thought about it, really thought about it, because she deserved a real answer. "Where I come from," he said slowly, "there is this idea. It is not written down anywhere official. It is just something people know. That if someone has kids and no food, you help. You don't ask what species they are, or what planet they come from, or whether helping them makes logical sense. You just help. That is it." Zale was quiet for a long time, and her markings shifted through colors he had not seen before. Deep purples and silvers that moved like slow water. "My people had a word for this," she said finally, "for the one who gives without counting. We called it Vethon. It means the hand that opens in the dark." Kale smiled at her, and she did not smile back, because Vathari did not smile, but her markings glowed warm and bright and steady, which was better than any smile he had ever seen. That night, after Zale went down to sing to the cocoons, Kale sat at the comm relay and checked his supply order status. Everything was fine. The shipment was on its way. No flags, no alerts. But what Kale did not know, what he could not have known, was that his signal, careful as he had been, had not gone unnoticed. 12 light-years away, in a cramped cockpit that smelled of recycled air and cold efficiency, a Krillian bounty hunter named Drego Voss was reviewing a data intercept report, and one line in particular had caught his attention. A communication signal originating from Arion 4, a world that was supposed to be completely dead. Drego pulled up the old colony records for Arion 4, noted the recent property transfer to a human named Kale Morrow, and cross-referenced the planet's soil composition against a very specific biological profile. His cold, scaled face did not change expression. Krillians rarely showed emotion, but his clawed hand moved to the navigation console with a speed that spoke louder than any expression ever could, and engaged his faster-than-light drive, and his ship vanished into the black between stars like a knife sliding into dark water. The alarm came as a soft chime on the old perimeter sensor that Kale had repaired 3 days ago, more out of habit than any real expectation that it would ever be needed. And when he looked at the readout, his stomach dropped like a stone thrown into a well. A ship had entered Arion 4's atmosphere. It was not a cargo vessel, not a supply shuttle, not a lost traveler looking for directions. The signature was compact, fast, and running low-emission protocols that were designed to avoid detection, which meant that whoever was flying it did not want to be seen. Kale grabbed his compad and ran for the community hall, taking the ladder down into the tunnel so fast he nearly fell. And he found Zale sitting with the cocoons, her lower arms resting gently on Sunny's glowing surface, while she hummed a melody that made the air feel thick with something sacred. "Someone is here," he said, and the way he said it, tight, urgent, controlled, told her everything his words did not. Zale's markings went from warm amber to ice white in less than a second, and her eyes shifted to that deep, terrible red he had seen on the first day, the color of prey that knows the predator has found it. She stood up, and her forearms drew close to her body, and she looked at the cocoons and then at the ladder, and her whole being seemed to vibrate with a single overwhelming impulse. "Run. Take the children. Run now. We cannot move them," she whispered, and her voice broke on the last word. "They are bonded to the soil. If we pull them out now, they will not survive the shock. Kale, they are 3 weeks from hatching. We cannot." "Then we do not move them," Kale said. "But the hunter, if it is a hunter, the hegemony sends hunters. They always send hunters. They do not stop. They never stop. Then the hunter does not get down here," Kale said, and something in his voice had changed. Something had shifted from the easy-going freight hauler who made jokes and named cocoons into something older and harder and more stubborn than any wall ever built. "I need you to stay with the children. Keep them calm. Keep singing. Do whatever you need to do. And I need you to trust me." Zale looked at him, and for a moment her markings flickered through a dozen colors so fast he could not read them. And then they settled on something he had never seen, a deep, steady violet that burned like a slow flame. "I trust you," she said, and the words sounded like they cost her everything she had. Kale climbed the ladder and closed the hatch behind him, and stood in the community hall, and took one long breath, and then he went to work. He had 6 hours before that ship would reach the town, maybe less, and he was not a soldier, and he didn't have weapons, and he did not have training. But he was a human being, and human beings had been turning desperate situations into survivable ones since before they left their first planet. He started with the buildings. He rigged Building 6 to collapse. It was already leaning badly, and all it took was removing 3 support bolts and replacing them with a friction pin that would give way under any weight heavier than a human. And when it fell, it would take the walkway between Buildings 5 and 7 with it, blocking the main approach from the east. He pulled the heating coils from buildings 9 and 10 and wired them to the old power junction in building 3, creating a system that would blast superheated air through the ventilation grates on command. Not enough to kill, but enough to blind and disorient anyone walking through. He scattered metal debris across the western approach and covered it with dust so it looked like flat ground, turning it into a field of ankle-breaking obstacles that would slow down anything on 2 legs. He created false heat signatures by filling containers with heated water and placing them in buildings on the far side of town, so that any thermal scanner would show multiple potential targets spread across the settlement. And in the community hall itself, he set his final trap. He disconnected the power coupling from the lighting grid and connected it to the metal door frame of the main entrance, turning it into a contact shock system that would deliver a jolt strong enough to drop a large mammal. All of it was improvised, all of it was crude, and none of it would stop a professional killer for long. But it did not need to stop him. It just needed to slow him down, confuse him, make him cautious, make him doubt. Because doubt was the only weapon Kale really had. Drago Voss landed his ship 1 kilometer north of Harrowfield and approached on foot, because he was professional, and professionals did not fly directly into an unknown situation, no matter how simple the briefing made it sound. He was Krillian, tall, lean, covered in fine, dark scales that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, with eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not name, and a brain that processed tactical information the way a river processed gravity, naturally and without effort. He had been hunting Vathari for 11 months, ever since the hegemony had contracted his guild to handle the biological removal of remaining survivors. And in that time, he had tracked down and eliminated 14 targets across 9 systems. This should have been number 15. His scanner showed 1 Vathari biosignature and 1 human, which confused him slightly, because his briefing contained no mention of a human combatant. But he filed the confusion away and kept moving, because confusion was just incomplete information, and incomplete information was resolved by observation. He entered Harrowfield from the eastern approach, walking between buildings 5 and 7, and that was when building 6 came down on top of him. Not hit him directly. His reflexes were too fast for that, but it forced him sideways into the debris field, where his right foot caught on a buried support strut and sent him stumbling forward into the ventilation grate of Building 3, which exploded with superheated air that seared across his face and temporarily overloaded his thermal vision. By the time he recovered, rolling sideways and drawing his weapon, the town was silent again. Drago stood very still in the dust and reassessed. The human, he realized, was not a bystander. He moved through the town slowly after that, checking every approach, scanning every building, and finding the traps one by one. The debris field, the false heat signatures, the rigged structures, and each one he found increased his respect for the person who had built them by a small but measurable degree. This was not military work. It was too messy, too improvised, too creative in ways that military training actively discouraged. This was the work of someone who knew how things broke and was very good at making them break on purpose. It took Drago 2 hours to cross a town that should have taken 10 minutes, and by the time he reached the community hall, his patience was thin but intact, and his professional curiosity was fully engaged. He scanned the doorframe, detected the electrical trap, and disabled it by cutting the power coupling with a single precise shot from his sidearm. Then he stepped inside. Kale was waiting for him. He stood in the middle of the community hall, directly above the hatch, with a plasma cutter in his right hand and a wrench in his left, and he was bleeding from a cut on his forehead where a piece of debris had caught him during his own trap setup, and his left arm was burned from a misfire on the heating coils, and his ribs ached where he had fallen off a roof while placing the false heat signatures. Measure like a man who had already lost. Drago raised his weapon, a sleek Krillian pulse pistol that could put a hole through a ship hull, and aimed it at Kale's center mass with the casual precision of someone who had done this many, many times. "Step aside, human," Drago said, and his voice was flat and dry and carried no emotion at all, like stone speaking. "I am here under Hegemony Contract 77 Alpha for the biological removal of a Class 7 invasive species. This is not your concern, and interference carries a penalty of—" "Those are children," Kale said. The words came out steady and clear, and they filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with volume. "The entity below is classified as—" "I do not care what your paperwork says," Kale said, and he stepped forward, closer to the gun, not away from it, and his hands were shaking, but his voice was not. "I do not care what classification some committee gave them to make themselves feel better about what they did. There is a mother down there with 5 unhatched children, and they are 3 weeks from being born. And you are not going through that hatch." "You cannot stop me," Drago said, and it was not a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who knew exactly how strong he was, and exactly how weak the man in front of him was. "Maybe not," Kale said, "but I can make you kill me to get past me. And you will have to look at what is down there after you do. You will have to see the cocoons and hear them singing and know that they were 3 weeks away from being alive. And you will have to carry that." Drago did not move. The silence stretched between them, like a wire pulled tight enough to sing. And then the hatch opened behind Kale, and Zyle climbed out. She stood beside him, all 4 arms at her sides, and her bioluminescent markings were not blazing in fear or flashing. In panic, they were burning with a steady, fierce, unwavering light that Drago had never seen in any Vathari he had ever hunted. Every other Vathari had run from him. Every single one. They had hidden and fled and begged, because that was what the hunted did when the hunter came. But this one was not running. This one was standing next to a bleeding, shaking human with a plasma cutter. And her light was not the light of fear. It was the light of someone who had found something worth standing for. Drago looked at them, the broken human and the glowing alien mother. And something moved in the deep architecture of his Krillian brain. Something old and buried and almost forgotten. His people had a concept, Vrekthal, that had no clean translation, but meant something close to the bond that outweighs the contract. The recognition that some connections between living beings carried a weight that commerce and duty could not match. At Vrekthal, and he knew it, and it changed the mathematics of the situation in ways his training had not prepared him for. Drago lowered his weapon. "I am going to leave," he said, and his voice was still flat, but there was something underneath it now. Something that sounded almost like reluctance. "I will file a report that states the trail went cold on Arion 4. This will buy you time. Weeks, perhaps a month. But the hegemony will send others, and they will not be me, and they will not hesitate." He looked at Kale one more time, and his cold reptilian eyes held a question that he did not ask out loud. Then he turned and walked out of the community hall and back through the ghost town and across the dust to his ship. And 5 minutes later, his engine lit up the orange sky, and he was gone. Kale stood there until the sound of the ship faded into nothing, and then his legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the floor, and Zale caught him with her lower arms. Before he fell all the way, "You are hurt," she said. "I am fine," he lied. She made that sound again, the one that was almost a laugh, and her upper arms wrapped around his shoulders while her lower arms kept him upright, and her markings glowed in warm, steady gold that meant safe, that meant home, that meant you are not alone anymore. "You are the strangest creature I have ever met," she told him. "Thank you," he said, and closed his eyes and let her hold him up. The days after Drago left were quiet in a way that felt different from the silence that had greeted Kale when he first arrived. This was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of holding your breath, of waiting for something to begin. Zale treated his injuries with Vathari bioresin, spreading the glowing substance across his burned arm and the cut on his forehead with her two lower hands, while her upper hands held his face still with a gentleness that surprised them both. "This will bond with your tissue," she said. "It will heal faster than your human medicine. Hold still." "It tingles," Kale said. "Good. That means it is working." "It really tingles. Are you sure this is not eating my skin?" "If it were eating your skin, you would not be talking. You would be screaming. Hold still." The resin worked better than anything Kale had ever used, and within 3 days, his arm was healed, with only a faint silvery scar that caught the light in a way that looked almost Vathari. And Giles stared at it with fascination, because the resin had never been used on a human before, and the result was something neither species had expected. But Kale was not thinking about his arm, or his scars, or even the threat that still hung over them like a storm that had not yet arrived. He was thinking about the future, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the future felt like something worth thinking about. He sat down at the comm relay on the 3rd night, and opened a channel on the old human frontier frequencies, the ones that independent colonists and free traders and the scattered, stubborn, forgotten people of the galaxy still used to talk to each other across the dark. He recorded a message, and he did not plan it, or write it down, or rehearse it. He just spoke the way a man speaks when he means every word. "My name is Kale Morrow, and I own a piece of land on Arion 4. It is not much, 40 buildings, and a lot of dust. But it has power and water and soil that is better than it has any right to be. I have a neighbor who needs protecting, and children who are about to be born, and the hegemony does not want them to exist. I am not asking for soldiers or heroes. I am asking for people who have nowhere else to go and are tired of running. If that is you, come to Harrowfield. I cannot promise it will be safe, but I can promise you will not be alone." He sent it and leaned back in his chair, and did not expect anything to come of it, because hope was a muscle he had not used in a long time, and it ached when he tried. But the galaxy, it turned out, was full of people who had nowhere else to go. The first response came 2 days later. A woman named Petra Vasquez, retired combat medic, 61 years old, who had spent the last 3 years on a station that was slowly being decommissioned around her, and who said in her reply, "I have been looking for a place like this. Reason to get up in the morning, and yours sounds better than most." The second response came the day after that. A Tarani engineer named Kel, who had left the hegemony after refusing to participate in what he called the bureaucratic extinction of a people, and who arrived in a ship that was held together by wire and stubbornness. Then, 2 human siblings, Rin and Dava, teenagers who had lost their colony to a corporate land seizure and had been living in a cargo container on a transit station for 8 months, and who showed up with nothing but each other and a willingness to work. And then, on the 7th day, a ship arrived that made Zale drop to her knees in the tunnel and press all 4 hands to the ground. An elder Vathari named Sorvan stepped off the shuttle with slow, careful movements, and skin that was so pale it was almost translucent, and markings that glowed with the deep, steady light of someone who had lived long enough to carry the memories of generations. She had thought she was the last, the very last of her kind still alive in the galaxy, and when Zhao climbed out of the tunnel and stood before her in the orange light of Arion 4's sun, the 2 of them did not speak. They sang. Their markings erupted in patterns so complex and so achingly beautiful that every other person in Harrowfield stopped what they were doing and stood still. And Kale watched, with tears running down his face that he did not bother to wipe away, because some things deserved tears, and this was one of them. They were not the last. 3 weeks passed, and the cocoons grew brighter every day. Kale could feel the change even from above ground. The humming had grown louder and more complex, shifting from a single tone to something that sounded like a conversation. Like 5 tiny voices learning to speak to each other for the first time. Zhao barely left the tunnel, spending every hour singing to the clutch with a focus and intensity that bordered on trance. And Sorvan joined her, adding her elder voice to the songs, weaving in memories and histories and the echoes of a world that no longer existed, but would live on in these 5 children, if they survived. Above ground, Harrowfield was transforming. Petra set up a medical station in Building 8, organized and efficient, and stocked with supplies she had brought, and supplies Kale had scavenged. And she looked at the settlement with the practical eye of someone who had kept people alive in worse conditions, and said, "I have seen uglier places thrive." Kel threw himself into the infrastructure with an engineer's passion, upgrading the solar array to 3 times its original output, rebuilding the water system with proper filtration and storage, and designing a perimeter defense grid using parts from his own ship that he stripped down without a moment of hesitation. Rin and Dava turned out to be tireless workers who approached every task with the desperate energy of young people who had finally found something to belong to. And within a week, they had cleared and repaired 6 additional buildings, and started what Rin called the ugliest garden in the galaxy, using nutrient-rich soil from the mining sublevel. It was not pretty, and it was not safe, and it was held together with effort and duct tape, and the stubborn refusal of a handful of people to accept that this was not going to work. But it was alive, and that was enough. The hatching began on a Tuesday. Kale knew it was a Tuesday because he had started keeping a calendar on the wall of his building, scratching marks into the metal with a screwdriver. And he would remember this particular Tuesday for the rest of his life. Zael's call came through the comm as a single word, "Now." And Kale dropped the wrench he was holding and ran for the community hall and took the ladder so fast his feet barely touched the ground. Rungs. P. The tunnel was filled with light. Every surface glowed, the resin on the walls, the soil in the basin, and the cocoons themselves, all 5 of them, blazing with a radiance that made Kale shield his eyes. And Zael was kneeling beside them, with all 4 arms spread wide, her markings cycling through every color in a sequence that was the most complex song she had ever sung. Sorvan knelt opposite her, adding her light to the pattern, and the 2 of them wove a tapestry of bioluminescence that filled the chamber like a living aurora. The first cocoon to open was sunny. The golden shell cracked along a seam that had not been there a moment before, and from within came a small, pale, translucent creature no bigger than a human forearm, with huge dark eyes that blinked in the light, and 4 tiny arms that reached out into the air as if trying to hold the whole world at once. Then navy, dark blue and calm and still, emerging with a quiet grace. Seemed impossible for something so new. Then spark, the smallest, bursting out with a flash of green-white light and immediately trying to crawl, tiny limbs moving in every direction with chaotic energy. Then the twins, together as always, their cocoons splitting at the same moment, 2 small bodies tumbling into the soil, side by side, their markings already pulsing in perfect sync. 5 Vathari children, alive and breathing and glowing in the dark beneath a ghost town on a world nobody wanted, born into a universe that had tried to make sure they never existed. Zael gathered them to her with all 4 arms, and the sound she made was not a word in any language Kale knew, but it did not need to be, because it was the sound every mother makes when she holds her children for the first time, and it is the same sound in every species, on every world, in every corner of the galaxy. The children looked at their mother with those huge new eyes, flickering as they learned to see and sense and be. And then they looked at Kale. He was sitting cross-legged on the tunnel floor, covered in dust and grease, with a faded scar on his arm that glowed faintly silver, and he was grinning so wide it hurt, and there were tears on his face, and he did not care. Sunny reached for him first, one tiny golden arm stretching out toward the strange, warm, non-Vathari creature who was sitting in the dirt and crying and smiling at the same time. And when that small hand touched Kale's finger, the baby's markings flashed in a pattern that Sorvan recognized, and that made the elder's breath catch. Imprint. Kale, Zale said, and her voice was raw and full and shaking with something bigger than any single emotion. In my culture, the one who guards the clutch through their hatching, the one who stands between the children and the dark, is given a title. She spoke a word in Vathari that sounded like light given. It means the one who chose us, she said. The shield parent. It is the highest honor my people can give, and it has never been given to someone who is not Vathari, and I do not care, because no Vathari has ever done what you have done. Kale opened his mouth to say something, and then closed it, and then opened it again. I do not know what to say, he admitted. Then for once in your life, say nothing, Jael said, and she pulled him in with her 3 free arms, while the 4th held her children, and the 5 tiny Vathari immediately began climbing on him, as if he were a very convenient and very warm piece of furniture. He laughed, and it was the first real laugh he had produced in years, and it echoed up through the hatch, and out into the streets of Harrowfield, where Petra and Quell and Rin and Dava heard it and smiled, because they knew what it meant. Weeks later, Kale sat on the porch of his building, the same building he had kicked the door open on that first day, and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold that he had once thought were ugly, and now thought were the most beautiful colors in the universe. 5 Vathari children were climbing on him, and Sunny had claimed his left shoulder as permanent territory, and Navy was asleep in his lap, and Spark was trying to eat his bootlace, and the twins were having a light pattern argument on his right arm that he could feel as gentle warm pulses against his skin. Zale sat beside him, her markings glowing in soft, content patterns he had learned to read as laughter and peace and home. The street in front of them was no longer empty. Petra was arguing with Kel about the placement of a new water tank, and Rin was hauling building materials while Deva directed from atop a half-finished structure, and Sorvan was walking slowly between the buildings, with her markings telling stories to the air. A new ship appeared in orbit, and then another, and Kale looked up at the sky and felt something that he recognized as fear, but also as something else, something that tasted like iron and stubbornness, and the absolute refusal to let go of what he had built. The hegemony had not forgotten, but neither had the galaxy. Word had spread, through frontier frequencies and trade routes, and whispered conversations in the back rows of auction halls. The story of a ghost town on a dead world, of a human who stood over a hatch with a plasma cutter, and told a bounty hunter that children were children no matter what the paperwork said. The galaxy had many words for humans. Reckless was one, and irrational was another, and sentimental, and loud, and stubborn, and infuriatingly unwilling to mind their own business. Kale Morrow had paid 100 credits for a dead town on a dead world, and he had turned it into a home with his bare hands, and a wrench, and a heart that was too stupid to know when to. He sat on his porch, with 5 alien children climbing on him, and a mother who glowed like starlight beside him, and a community of broken people who had come together because a stranger on a dead world had said, "You will not be alone." And for the first time in his life, Kale Morrow was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not bad for 100 credits.